Good morning, everyone. Brett Kavanaugh speaking from my chambers on what's shaping up to be one of those Washington mornings where everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down. So I'm sitting here with my third cup of coffee. Yeah, third, because what I'm about to tell you kept me up most of the night when I get this call from someone I've known since my days in the Bush White House. Can't tell you who, but let's just say this person has worked in every Republican administration since Reagan and a few Democratic ones too. Brett, he says, we need to talk. There are things happening that go way beyond what any president actually controls, and it's gotten worse since you've been on the court. That conversation led to the most eye-opening week of my career in Washington. And folks, I've been here long enough to think I'd seen everything. The phone call that changed everything. Last Tuesday night, around 9 p.m., I'm in my study reviewing case files when my secure phone rings. Not my regular phone, the one they gave me when I became a justice, the one that's supposedly encrypted and monitored only by people with the highest security clearances. The voice on the other end is someone I recognize immediately, a career intelligence professional who's briefed every president since Bush Sr. Justice Kavanaugh, he says, I'm retiring next month. And there are things you need to know about how this city really works. Things that might affect cases coming before your court. We meet the next day at a small restaurant in Arlington. Nothing fancy, the kind of place where retired military officers and intelligence folks go to have conversations they can't have in official buildings. What he tells me over the course of 3 hours fundamentally changes how I understand American government, the permanent government. Brett, he says, pouring sugar into his coffee, you've been on the court for what, 6 years now? And you probably think you understand how power works in Washington. President makes decisions, Congress passes laws, you interpret them. Clean constitutional framework, right? I nod, wondering where this is going. Wrong, dead wrong. There's another layer of government that most Americans don't know exists. We call it the permanent government, or if you want to be more direct about it, the deep state. And it's been running American foreign policy for decades, regardless of who's in the White House. He pulls out a tablet, shows me an organizational chart that's unlike anything I've seen in civics textbooks. Look at this. When a new president takes office, they get to appoint about 4,000 people out of a federal workforce of 2.2 million. That's less than 0.2% of the government. The other 99.8%. They were here before the president arrived, and they'll be here after he leaves. But here's the kicker. In the national security apparatus, CIA, NSA, DIA, State Department intelligence, Pentagon intelligence, the permanent staff doesn't just implement policy, they shape it, they control the information flow, they decide what the president sees and what he doesn't see. The intelligence briefing reality. My contact explains something that shocked me. You know those daily intelligence briefings that every president receives, the ones that supposedly give him all the information he needs to make national security decisions. They're curated, filtered, designed to support predetermined policy directions. He gives me an example that I can't forget. During the lead-up to the Iraq War, intelligence analysts who questioned the WMD evidence found their reports blocked from reaching the White House. Meanwhile, reports that supported invasion were fast-tracked to the president's desk. The analysts who tried to present contrary evidence were marginalized, transferred, or forced out. Same thing happened with Syria, with Libya, with Afghanistan withdrawal. The intelligence community had information that contradicted official policy, but that information was buried while supporting evidence was amplified. I ask the obvious question, but doesn't the president have the authority to demand unfiltered intelligence? He laughs bitterly. In theory, yes. In practice, good luck with that. The president gets briefed by people who've been in the intelligence community for 20, 30 years. They know how to present information in ways that lead to predetermined conclusions. And if a president starts asking inconvenient questions, well, there are ways to handle that. The career bureaucrat power. Over the next few days, I start paying closer attention to how cases come before our court, and I notice patterns I'd never seen before. Cases involving national security often include classified annexes, documents that only justices with appropriate clearances can review. But here's what I realized. Those classified documents are prepared by career intelligence officials, not by the elected officials who are supposedly making policy. So when we're ruling on the constitutionality of surveillance programs, trade restrictions, or military actions, we're often relying on information provided by the same permanent bureaucracy that designed those programs in the first place. It's like asking someone to grade their own homework. I start making calls to people I know across different agencies. What I learn is disturbing. In every major department, defense, state, justice, treasury, homeland security, career bureaucrats have developed sophisticated methods for controlling information flow and limiting the ability of political appointees to change direction. The Mueller investigation example. My intelligence contact gives me an example that really hits home: the Mueller investigation. Whatever you think about Trump or Russia, he says, the Mueller investigation was fundamentally about the permanent bureaucracy defending itself against a president who threatened to disrupt established patterns. He explains, Trump came into office talking about ending wars, reducing overseas commitments, questioning intelligence assessments. From the perspective of the national security establishment, this was dangerous, not because Trump was necessarily wrong, but because it threatened institutional interests that had been decades in the making. So what happened? Career intelligence officials, career Justice Department prosecutors, career FBI agents launched an investigation that paralyzed the Trump administration for 2 years. Regardless of whether you think Trump colluded with Russia, the investigation served the purpose of preventing any fundamental change in American foreign policy. This bothers me on a constitutional level, but that's not how our system is supposed to work, I tell him. Voters elect presidents to make those kinds of changes. Exactly, he responds, but the voters don't elect the people who actually run the day-to-day operations of government, and those people have their own institutional interests. The Biden administration reality. Here's where it gets really interesting. My contact tells me that the same permanent bureaucracy that resisted Trump is now fully aligned with the Biden administration, but not because Biden is making fundamentally different decisions, because Biden is allowing the permanent bureaucracy to make the decisions. Look at Biden's foreign policy team, he says. Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland. These aren't outsiders bringing fresh perspectives. These are career Washington insiders who've been part of the permanent establishment for decades. They're implementing policies that were developed by the same bureaucratic structures that have been in place since the Clinton administration. Biden isn't changing the direction of American foreign policy. He's restoring the permanent bureaucracy's control over American foreign policy. This explains something I'd been wondering about: why Biden's foreign policy looks so similar to Obama's, which looked so similar to Bush's, which looked so similar to Clinton's. Different presidents, different parties, but remarkably similar approaches to China, Russia, the Middle East, NATO, trade policy. It's not because these presidents all independently reached the same conclusions. It's because they're all being advised by the same permanent bureaucratic structure. The congressional illusion. I decide to test this theory by talking to some members of Congress that I know personally. What I learn is even more disturbing. A senior senator who sits on the Intelligence Committee tells me, Brett, we get briefed by career intelligence officials who tell us what they want us to know. When we ask hard questions, they say the information is too sensitive to share in open session. When we ask for classified briefings, they control what documents we see. I've been on this committee for 12 years, and I've never seen a raw intelligence report. Everything is filtered through analytical summaries prepared by career analysts. We're making decisions about war and peace based on someone else's interpretation of someone else's information. A House member who chairs a key national security subcommittee puts it even more bluntly. We don't oversee the intelligence community. They manage us. They tell us what investigations to pursue, what questions to ask, what conclusions to reach, and if we don't play along, they leak damaging information about us to friendly reporters. This is a constitutional crisis that most Americans don't even know is happening. The Supreme Court's limitation. As I'm learning all this, I start to realize how it affects our work on the Supreme Court. When we review cases involving national security, we often defer to the expertise of the executive branch. But what if the expertise we're deferring to isn't coming from elected officials? In cases involving surveillance programs, drone strikes, immigration enforcement, trade restrictions, we're often told that certain information is too sensitive to share, even with the Supreme Court. So we make constitutional decisions based on incomplete information. But here's what really bothers me. The incomplete information we receive is filtered through the same permanent bureaucracy that designed the programs we're reviewing. They control both the policy and the information we use to evaluate the constitutionality of that policy. That's not judicial independence, that's judicial manipulation. The media complicity. During my week of conversations with various Washington insiders, I start to understand how the media fits into the system. It's not what people think. A former senior State Department official explains, the major news organizations in Washington, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Fox, Wall Street Journal, they all have reporters who've been covering national security for decades. These reporters have relationships with career intelligence officials that go back years or even decades. When the permanent bureaucracy wants to shape public opinion, they leak information to these trusted reporters. The reporters get exclusive scoops, the bureaucracy gets favorable coverage. It's a symbiotic relationship. And when an elected official tries to change policy in ways the permanent bureaucracy doesn't like, negative leaks start appearing in the media. Suddenly there are stories about chaos, incompetence, dangerous decision-making. This explains the remarkable consistency of mainstream media coverage, regardless of which party controls the White House. Different presidents, different parties, but the same sources providing the same types of leaks to the same reporters. The real power centers. By the end of the week, I have a completely different understanding of how Washington actually works. The real power isn't held by the people whose names you know. The president, congressional leaders, Supreme Court justices. It's held by people you've never heard of. Career officials at CIA who control intelligence assessments, senior bureaucrats at state who control diplomatic communications, Pentagon officials who control military options presented to the president, Justice Department career prosecutors who decide which investigations to pursue and which to ignore. These people aren't elected. They're not confirmed by the Senate. They serve across multiple administrations, and they develop institutional perspectives that transcend party politics. And here's the key. They view themselves as guardians of American interests against the temporary and often misguided impulses of elected officials. From their perspective, presidents come and go, but American foreign policy must maintain continuity. Congressional representatives worry about re-election, but national security requires long-term thinking. Supreme Court justices interpret laws, but career bureaucrats understand operational realities. They see themselves as the adults in the room, protecting America from the democratic process. The constitutional question. As a justice sworn to uphold the Constitution, this presents me with a fundamental dilemma. The Constitution gives power to elected officials, the President, Congress, and indirectly the Supreme Court. But the practical reality is that much of that power has been captured by unelected, unaccountable career bureaucrats. Is this constitutional? Is it sustainable? Is it even necessarily bad? The argument for the permanent bureaucracy is that governance requires expertise, continuity, and institutional memory that elected officials can't provide. Presidents serve for 4 or 8 years. Congressional representatives worry about elections every 2 years. The permanent bureaucracy provides stability and competence. The argument against is that this system subverts democratic accountability. If career bureaucrats are making the real decisions, then voters don't actually control their government. That's not a republic. It's an oligarchy with democratic window dressing. The Trump resistance. Looking back at the Trump presidency with this new understanding, everything makes more sense. Trump represented a genuine threat to the permanent bureaucracy, not because he was corrupt or incompetent, but because he questioned fundamental assumptions that the career establishment had accepted for decades. Trump talked about ending foreign wars. The national security establishment has institutional interests in maintaining global military presence. Trump questioned intelligence assessments about Russia. The intelligence community has institutional interests in maintaining threat assessments that justify their budgets and authorities. Trump wanted to reduce regulatory oversight. Career bureaucrats and regulatory agencies have institutional interests in expanding their authority. The resistance to Trump wasn't primarily about protecting democracy from authoritarianism. It was about protecting the permanent bureaucracy from democratic accountability. The Biden restoration. The Biden administration represents a restoration of permanent bureaucratic control. Biden's team consists largely of people who were part of the career establishment during previous Democratic administrations. They're not outsiders bringing change, they're insiders restoring the status quo. This explains why Biden's policies look so similar to Obama's, even though the world has changed dramatically since 2016. It's not because Biden independently reached the same conclusions as Obama. It's because both administrations are controlled by the same permanent bureaucratic structure. And this structure has its own interests, its own assumptions, its own policy preferences that remain constant regardless of election outcomes. What this means for democracy. The implications of all this are staggering. If the permanent bureaucracy really does control American policy, then elections don't matter as much as we think they do. Voters can change the faces at the top, but they can't change the fundamental direction of government. This explains why American foreign policy has been so consistent across different administrations. It explains why promised changes rarely happen. It explains why Washington seems so disconnected from the preferences of voters. It also raises serious constitutional questions. The Constitution assumes that elected officials control the executive branch, but if career bureaucrats are making the real decisions, then the Constitution isn't functioning as designed. My personal struggle. As I sit here in my Supreme Court chambers, I'm struggling with what to do with this knowledge. Do I continue to defer to executive expertise when I know that expertise is filtered through unelected bureaucrats? Do I demand more transparency in cases involving national security, even if it means challenging the permanent bureaucracy? And what about my role in the broader system? The Supreme Court is supposed to check the power of the other branches of government. But how do you check the power of a bureaucratic structure that operates in the shadows? These aren't abstract constitutional questions anymore. They're practical challenges that affect every major case we review. The way forward. I don't have easy answers, but I do know this. The American people deserve to know how their government actually works. They deserve to know who's making the decisions that affect their lives, and they deserve democratic accountability over those decisions. Whether the permanent bureaucracy is good or bad for America is a separate question. What's not debatable is that it should be subject to democratic oversight. If career bureaucrats are going to make policy decisions, then voters should have some way to hold them accountable. That might mean fundamental reforms to how the federal government operates. It might mean stronger congressional oversight. It might mean more transparency in how information flows to elected officials. Or it might mean accepting that the American system has evolved beyond what the founders intended and figuring out how to make that evolution work in service of democratic values rather than in opposition to them. Looking ahead. What I learned this week has changed how I understand my role as a justice. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't ignore the reality that much of what we call government policy is actually permanent bureaucracy policy. The question is what to do about it. How do we restore democratic accountability without destroying the expertise and continuity that make government function? How do we preserve constitutional governance while acknowledging the operational realities of modern administration? These are the questions that will define the next phase of American political development. and they're questions that go way beyond party politics or ideological differences. They're about who really governs America and whether the people have any meaningful control over their own government. Thanks for listening, folks. Next week, we'll dive into something equally disturbing: how foreign governments have learned to manipulate the American political system through the same permanent bureaucracy we've been discussing. Until then, keep asking who's really in charge, because the answer might surprise you